The Republican Party, which used to be called in the previous party system the Party of Great Moral Ideas, is now called the Party of Prosperity. In other words, this is like as McKinley called Party of the Full Dinner Pail. Notice the shift from so-called, what we now call social issues, prohibition, crushing Catholics, and all the rest of it, to a much more modest, stressing the economic issues, protective tariff, things like that. The Democrats now become the Party of Piety, the great moral crusade against the saloon. And but over the as the years go by, the pietists begin to shift back to the Republican Party. And they begin to, first of all, pietists, well, they begin to have second thoughts or whatever, and we wind up with the Republican Party as the major party, as they say. Look at here's a table of partisan leads. In other words, party leads in percentage points. For example, if one party gets 51% of the vote, let's say the Democrats get 51%, the Republicans get 49%, this means a 2 percentage point lead. Okay? So in a close election, you'll have leads of 2%, 3%, 4%. When the leads get much bigger, it means you're really crushing the opposition. Now here we have, for each region in the country, average from 1882 to 92, and the average from 1894 to 1904. In other words, before and after the Great Change. Yeah, good, Hans. Cut out the gigglers. Also, we've got plenty of air coming in from the broken window. We don't really need them. New England, before the change, was moderately Republican, fairly heavily Republican, a very pietist, as we know, Yankee area, plus 8.1% lead. In other words, Republican lead. Afterward, becomes plus 23.6%. In other words, becomes very heavily Republican, overwhelmingly Republican. The Middle Atlantic states, which are neck and neck, this is New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, etc., where it was 0.1% Republican. It was really tied, very close elections, now becomes plus 16.9% Republican, overwhelmingly Republican. Right? In other words, we now have, and this is true up until 1932, really, from 1896, except for Woodrow Wilson's election, which is a fluke. East, North, Central, which is what we call the Midwest, in other words, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, basically, which had been 1.1% Republican, in other words, almost tied again, now becomes 14.8% Republican. So overwhelmingly Republican. Right? West, North, Central, I guess would be the Prairie states, Iowa, the Dakotas, etc., which had been very heavily Republican, 18.1, is now even more so. And then we have the South, which had been heavily Democratic, gets more Democratic, becoming more pietist, plus 32.6% Democrat, now becomes plus 39. What happened in the South was the so-called progressives take over. We'll get to the progressives, of course, very soon now. Progressive era, approximately 1900, 1918, or 1900, 1920, whatever you want to call it, when both parties become progressives or statists. The Southern progressivism meant progressive disfranchisement of blacks. What happened after the Civil War was the white voters voted Democratic, the blacks voted Republican, almost automatically. They began a progressive disfranchisement of black voters, so that almost no blacks in the South voted by about 1900. Various ways for example, in order to vote in the South, you had to interpret the state constitution to the satisfaction of the election official, who was always white. So it's very subjective. First of all, who knows what the state constitution is? Who knows the New York state constitution? So you can always claim that a black can't really interpret the Constitution properly. That was the end of that. Also, there's a poll tax, fairly heavy, which disfranchised most poor white voters. So the result was a very restricted suffrage and a one-party region. The border states, up here, which was essentially Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, etc., places like that, which had been 10.9% Democrat, now become neck and neck, in other words, 0.6. This again shows the shift toward Republican, except for the South, shift toward the Republican Party. And the mountain states, which are essentially the free silver states that I talked about, Idaho, Wyoming, et cetera, which had been 11.7% Republican. And now 3.8% Democratic. This is the attraction of Bryanism and free silver. The Pacific states, California, Oregon, Washington, which had been 3.5% Republican, are now 15.5% Republican. So we have a basic shift throughout. States which are slightly Republican become heavily Republican. States which were tied, especially Middle Atlantic and Midwest, now become heavily Republican. So we wind up, as I say, with essentially south of the Democratic region and a few big cities. Even the big cities are now neck and neck. Really only the Irish, as I said last time, are dedicated Democrats. The others begin to shift over. As a whole, we now have U.S. total and U.S. outside the South, non-South. The previous 1882 to 92 average had been 2.4% Republican, and now shifts from 2.4% Republican to 14.5% Republican, overwhelming, and including the South, was 3.7% Democrat, is now 7.7% Republican. So we have, in other words, essentially a one-and-a-half party system, basically a Republican system with the south as a one-party region, and some big cities. Even the big cities, however, begin to shift. For example, Boston, which had been heavily Democratic, is now more or less tied, sort of even. Brooklyn, which used to be an important separate city, by the way, until about after 1900, was heavily Democratic, is now about tied with Republicans. I'm not talking about now, of course, I'm talking about after 1896. Baltimore, which had been heavily Democratic, is now heavily Republican, and Chicago, which had been heavily Democratic, is now heavily Republican. So even the big cities shift. We're not used to that now. We're not used to the idea of Republican big cities, but they were there before 1932. So along with this comes a drop in the turnout rate. Now we hear a lot about the drop in the turnout rate now, and people act as if the turnout rate only started dropping after 1950 or so. In other words, turnout rate means the percentage of eligible voters actually turn out and vote. I'm not talking about registered voters, I'm talking about those who could vote, those over 21, that sort of stuff. It's now down to about 38%, very low, of course. Back in the old days, in the third-party system, it was about 90%, and higher, of course, in presidential elections. Turnout rate begins to drop very quickly. The drop starts in 1896. It starts when the party system shifts to a non-ideological, not much contest either, because heavily Republican, and non-ideological, because there's not too much difference between the parties. And so people being faced with an echo rather than a choice, to take the words of Barry Goldwater, famous words of Goldwater's campaign in 1964, we offer the public a choice, not an echo. Essentially, parties have been echoes of each other since 1900. The turnout rate begins to drop very quickly after 1896. For example, this is the turnout rate as a percentage of eligible voters. Percentage of voters that could vote. Which drops. It only increases, by the way, in the border states, which now become close contests, and the mountain states. All the others drop sharply. Here we have 1874 to 92 average turnout for all elections. 1900 to 1918. New England. This includes presidential and non-presidential, so it's lower than it would be for presidential, as we'll see in a minute. 56% this period drops to 48. That's a drop of 8 percentage points. Middle Atlantic states, which on average 68% turnout, drops to 55, minus 13. East, North, Central, which had been 75% turnout, drops to 61. West, North, Central, which had been 65%, drops to 62. South, of course, drops very heavily because half the people are disenfranchised. Blacks are disenfranchised and poor whites are disenfranchised. Turnout rate drops from 56% to 25%. 32%. 31. Border states drop from, well, actually, about the same, 66, 66. There's more intense party competition now. Mountain states go up with the increased competition, 55, 74. Not many people in the border and mountain states, however. Pacific drops from 53 to 44. Again, U.S. non-South drops from 67 to 57, and the South, the U.S. total, including the South, drops from 65 to 51. So here's a big shift right there after 1900. Now it's down about 38. Also, another thing happens. Now, some historians say it was due to the fact that registration comes in. In other words, see, before the 1900s, before the so-called progressive period, which we'll talk about at some length. By the way, progressive historians claim that the progressive era was an era of expanding democracy, right, with government regulation increasing and all that. If it's expanding democracy, how come the turnout rate drops? How come the number of people voting drops? What kind of expanding democracy is that? Okay. Anyway, the orthodox explanation for this drop in the turnout rate is that registration requirements increased. Before 1900, you didn't have to register. You just showed up and voted. So the whole idea of having to register 3 months in advance, of course, cuts down the number of votes. It was deliberately designed to do that, by the way. However, it does not explain the the drop in the turnout rate, because the drop in the turnout rate took place in urban areas and rural areas. The registration only came in urban areas for a long time. In other words, if you're a farmer or lived in upstate New York, you didn't have to register. Only city people had to register. There's an attack on the city voters by Republican WASPs against Democratic ethnics in the cities. That was the whole point, immigrants and so forth. But this particular drop in the turnout rate had nothing to do with registration requirements, because it was just as heavy in the rural areas as it was in the cities. And also, as I say, the turnout increased in the border and mountain states when people had something to vote about. They had some competition, at least, between the parties. A more severe drop we can see in the presidential turnout, which, of course, is of the greatest interest to people. The turnout rate in presidential elections, this is for all elections, this first table. And now we come to turnout rate presidential elections. Before the party system, before the third party system, in other words, from 1826 to 38, in the second party system period, the presidential turnout rate averaged was 55 to 58%. In 1840, which is the beginning, a very hot election between the Democrats and the Whigs, it was up to 80%. And between 1844 and 92, in other words, the heartland, the period of the third party system, more or less, was 70 to 84%, more on this end of it. And when it gets to 1896, election at 78%, and after that it begins to decline. In other words, 1900, 72%, 1904, 65, 1908, 68, 1912 at 56. A hotly contested election, by the way, but people began to lose interest. 1916, it was 60. So what you have is a basic drop from about 80% during the third party system to about 60 or 55, 60 around World War I, and it's been dropping ever since, of course, too. Another thing I have is, in addition to the overall drop, particularly drop concentrated in church members. Notice, before this again bolsters the idea that the whole thing is ethno-religious in origin. Church members voted much more heavily, whether it's Catholic or Protestant or pietists or liturgical, voted much more heavily than non-church members, because they were much more fired up. The drop in church members is much greater. In other words, a big turnout rate drop, voting rate drop for church members, and a big drop among the poor. Before 1900, poor people voted even more heavily than wealthy people. This, of course, has been a big drop among poor people, still to this day. Poor people are not interested. Why aren't they interested? The usual approach is, well, they're too apathetic, they're numbed by poverty. It's a lot of nonsense. They voted very heavily before that when they had something to be interested in. They had ideological issues to be interested in. And so the drop in the turnout rate coincides with this end of ideology sort of thing. Mr. Satchford, I think.
What was that turnout rate for what?
This is turnout rate for all elections. This is turnout rate for presidential elections, where the interest, of course, is always at a peak, contrasted to off-year elections. Same reason, yeah. Huh? Oh, yeah, the reason is the same, but I'm saying that they're concentrated more heavily among church members and poorer people where the interest is fired up in ideological issues. Many middle-class people vote because they think it's their civic duty. They learn in the schools it's their duty to vote. They don't really care. It's sort of an obligation. But in those days, voting was not an obligation. Voting, when people were fired up, they're intensely interested, especially if they were church members, either pietists or liturgical, and they had something to vote about. You know, it makes a great deal of sense. Also, you look at the newly eligible voters. Another interesting statistic. Those who either became 21 or just, or became naturalized aliens or whatever. They didn't have the habit of voting. So the first people to drop off and not vote are those who never voted anyway. So if you look at first voters, in other words, those who were newly eligible to vote, from 1876 to 92, 62% voted. In other words, 62% of the newly eligible voters voted that year. From 1900 to 1916, it's 41%. You have a big drop in first voters. And as I say, people who have always voted might continue to vote anyway, even if they had no choices anymore. They've always voted in elections. But the new voters are those who haven't picked up the habit yet. So they're the people first hit by the drop in interest, the drop in the basic choices available. Okay, McKinley is now president, and we have the McKinley cabinet. Examine the McKinley cabinet. Comes in 1896 in this new party revolution, so to speak. The cabinet is almost solidly a Rockefeller cabinet. Before I get to that for a second, I have to point out, by this time, by the late 1890s, there were two big financial groups in the country, power groups, the Morgans and the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers, as I say, run the Republican Party through an Ohio party. The Morgans are in the process of shifting from Democrat to Republican, or shifting their emphasis. Each one is a collection of financial groups. The Rockefellers, as I said before, always are together with a whole bunch of families, not just one guy. It's a whole bunch of families, the Pratts, the Bostwicks, the Bedfords, the Rogers, all these people have ever since then invested with the Rockefellers. You have a whole powerful complex. Also, each one begins to get their investment bank. In other words, investment banks become important. Commercial banks are important. These are depositing checking banks, etc. So each group begins to get their own insurance companies, their own commercial banks, their own investment banks. Life insurance companies in particular, as I mentioned before, ways of voting a lot of capital, amassing a lot of capital, which is run by trustees who get controlled by either Morgans or Rockefellers, and they vote for their guys and their companies. So we now have the following sort of financial group. In the J.P. Morgan group, of course, the headquarters of the J.P. Morgan and Company, which shifts from Philadelphia to New York around somewhere before this period, with Morgan Partners. These are all private partnerships. They get partners who are important, close to Morgan. And they run the biggest financial groups involved all over the country. But the Bankers Trust Company, which was set up to engage in trust certificates, new trust form. We'll see a little later how that becomes important in the Wilson administration. Is Morgan. It was founded in 1903. A little later. Their big commercial bank is the Chase National Bank, which is run by Morgans, which shifts in control, by the way, in 1930. It shifts to the big Rockefeller Bank. It's been the big Rockefeller commercial bank ever since. David Rockefeller was the chairman of the board until very recently. The First National Bank of New York, which is headed by George F. Baker, is probably the closest Morgan ally, long old friend, associate, whatever, another big commercial bank. By the way, the Rockefellers, I'll say in a minute, control National City Bank. That changed to Morgan control in the late 1930s, and after that, First National merged with National City to become First National City, and finally, of course, now Citibank, which has been a Morgan bank since the late 30s. Guaranteed Trust Company, commercial bank, which is now Morgan Guaranteed Trust, so it's officially Morgan, not just in reality. Mutual Life Insurance Company, which is their big life insurance. Mutual Life, and National Bank of Commerce. Anyway, these are the major, there are a whole bunch of other companies and railroads and all that, but these are the basic financial agglomeration. Well, the Rockefellers, of course, had Standard Oil as their basic, Standard Oil Trust as their basic, as their base of operation. And then they had Rockefeller, even though Rockefeller himself lasted until the age of 98, I think. I still remember he was still alive when I was growing up, and he had seen him sort of a mummy type. He was short and beady-eyed anyway. He began to look more mummy-ish as time went on. But he was sort of semi-retired by about 1900 or so. I mean, he wasn't really retired, but he was beginning to phase out a bit. His brother, William Rockefeller, becomes a key figure, and who takes charge of the National City Bank, which was run by James Stillman. So Stillman and Rockefeller form an alliance. National City Bank becomes their big commercial bank. And if the alliance was even more personal than that, because William Rockefeller, by the way, is president of Standard Oil in New York, which then later became Saucony Vacuum, I think finally became Mobil, yeah. And the two sons of William Rockefeller marry the two daughters of Stillman. I think it's that way. It's that way the other way around. I think that's the way it is. Yeah. Two sons of the two Rockefellers marry two Stillmans. This is what happens, by the way, in dynastic marriages. Of course, it happened with kings and queens and all that. It also happens in the top power elite in the United States, where you have intermarriages. You try not to have a situation. Bobo Rockefeller and one of the Rockefeller daughters married a coal miner, I think, back in the 50s. It's frowned on. Usually what happens is you marry, there's social institutions, you're marrying your own set. And here you have two Rockefellers marrying two Stillmans, which sort of cements the Rockefeller-Stillman alliance that controls the National City Bank. U.S. Trust Company, I think was in Boston, was Rockefeller. One of the few Boston financial. Farmers Loan and Trust Company, etc. There's a whole bunch, I think, okay. And Rockefeller still needs an investment bank. You see, he's got a couple of commercial banks, got National City. He needs some kind of alliance with an investment banker. Obviously, it's not going to be Morgan, because Morgan and Rockefeller hate each other's guts, and they're engaging economic and later we'll see political clashes. Rockefeller hooks up with Kuhn Loeb as a basic financial advisor. We have coming up in the late 19th century a group of German-Jewish investment banks in New York, Kuhn Loeb, Lehman Brothers, a bunch of others, Loeb, Rhodes, and so forth and so on. Kuhn Loeb was a major one, and it was connected with German banking firms, Warburg and Company, all interrelated in Germany. And Jacob Schiff was the maximum leader of the Kuhn Loeb. So Schiff forms an alliance with Rockefeller against Morgan. Obviously, there's a big conflict between the Morgans and Kuhn Loeb, etc. And so Schiff forms an alliance with Rockefeller in this mighty titanic economic financial struggle. Another person becomes important in this whole period to understand both the economics and political end of it. The last of the great tycoons, I've already mentioned some of the great tycoons, Hill, Gould, Rockefeller, and Carnegie, super tycoon types who start with almost nothing and wind up as real big shots. And Morgan, to some extent, although his father was quite a wealthy British banker. This is Edward H. Harriman, another a very important figure, has been underestimated by historians, both in his economic and his political influence. The New Deal, for example, the Roosevelt New Deal was really a Harriman New Deal, and the role of the Harriman family has been underrated. W. Averill Harriman, former governor of New York, was the political arm of the Harriman financial group. He's still beloved. He's about 90 years old or something. He's still very powerful politically in the Democratic Party. At any rate, Edward H. Harriman started as he was also short, thin. This enters, by the way, in a personal conflict. Since Morgan was tall and beefy and charismatic and whatever, one of the reasons he hated Harriman is he referred to him as Little Harriman. Rockefeller is also short. Hill is short too, and he formed an alliance with Morgan. So it doesn't work. It's not a one-to-one correlation, but it's part of the. At any rate, Harriman grows up as a fairly poor. I think he was born in Long Island. and becomes a young clerk in Wall Street. In other words, he becomes like a runner, or whatever it is. I forget what they call him, bulletin boy or something. He posts the stock prices. He starts at the age of 14 or something as a bulletin boy, and becomes very. He's poor. He's son of a minister. No education. None of these guys went to college, of course. Didn't waste time going to college. I keep stressing this. He becomes, quotation boy, is what it's called. Chalking up on the black. There was no computers then, of course. Chalking up the quotations. And he rises very quickly to become a top stockbroker. He's a brilliant really financial genius, Harriman, and very good at stock manipulation, stockbroking. He marries in 1879. He's born in 1848. Marries Miss Averill. I don't know her first name. I suppose I could dig it out if I'm really interested. Her father owned a small railroad in upstate New York. And he buys the railroad out, becomes head of it and buys it out. And from this, he starts becoming a railroad tycoon. It's really brilliant. I mean, he just goes from one railroad, starts with a small railroad line, ends up with a bigger railroad, medium-sized railroad, and he winds up controlling, first he gets control of Illinois Central in 1881. He clashes with Morgan. Now, here's Morgan running the whole railroad world, not used to some young upstart, suddenly buying railroads out from under him. Dubuque and Sioux City Railroad was a very important Morgan railroad in the Midwest, and even though not too big, Morgan loved it, and all of his pals are running it. Harriman takes it away from him and buys it out from under him, using all sorts of stock fights and so forth and so on. In 1886, in other words, he grabs control over Morgan of the Dubuque and Sioux City Railroad. And here's Morgan, used to, the whole railroad world was supposed to be his oyster, so to speak. And here's this young upstart grabbing it away from him, and he hated Harriman from then on. So Harriman begins to take over railroad after railroad. He takes over, as they become bankrupt or whatever, he begins to take them over. Finally he takes over, by the 1890s, he takes over Union Pacific, takes over Southern Pacific, which includes Central Pacific. He's now running the whole shtick, all the transcontinental railroads except Northern Pacific and Hill's Great Northern. Okay? So, Hill, also in the 1890s, Hill completed the Great Northern without competing Northern Pacific. Northern Pacific was sort of bankrupt. Morgan takes over Northern Pacific and forms an alliance with Hill. Caesar Hill is a very good railroad man, and he forms the big Morgan-Hill alliance and tries to get control of Burlington and Quincy, which goes from, is the way to get from Omaha or whatever to Chicago. And Harriman beats him out for that. And again, big titanic clashes. And Harriman now moves to try to get control of Northern Pacific from Morgan. Titanic struggle, huge amount of money involved. Who gets control of Northern Pacific? Big stock fight, big hysteria involved here in the late 1890s. And Harriman forms an alliance with Rockefeller and Kuhn Loeb as against Morgan and Hill for the control of the Northern Pacific. And this becomes politically very important because I'm convinced this is part of the reason for the Titanic struggle politically, which starts with Teddy Roosevelt's administration. We'll get to it very shortly now. After we talk about the mergers and their failure. But politically what's happening here is we have the Harriman, Rockefeller, Kuhn Loeb alliance, which continues from then on. In other words, basically to look at it very simply, Teddy Roosevelt was a McKinley administration was Rockefeller. Teddy Roosevelt was a Morgan person almost from birth, as we'll see. And we begin to have the two struggles that go on politically are essentially reflections of the struggle between the Rockefeller, Kuhn Loeb, Harriman alliance versus the Morgans. The New Deal of the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal was essentially a bitter attack on the Morgans. With the alliance of Rockefellers and Harriman, especially Harriman, who was a powerful Democratic Party person at this point. Anyway, we'll get this. So these are some of the behind-the-scenes struggles which make sense out of alleged political, at least lend clarity to alleged political struggles. At any rate, so this is building up with at the end of the McKinley administration. The fight over Northern Pacific, I'll get back to that. Just hold that in your mind as a great Northern Pacific struggle. Okay, McKinley has a cabinet in 1896. It's mostly Rockefeller, with a couple of stops for the Morgans. After all, Rockefeller was the winning combo. Rockefeller McKinley was the winning combination of the Republican Party, but the Morgans were now Republicans, or mostly, and so they had to have a certain stop. Let's go down the list of some of the top cabinet officials and general administration stalwarts. Secretary of State under McKinley was John Sherman of Ohio. Therefore, of course, Rockefeller, basically on the Rockefeller payroll for many years. When you say Ohio, you say Rockefeller, at least in the Republican Party. Secretary of the Treasury, of course, a key spot, was a certain Lyman J. Gage. Lyman Gage was had been a Chicago banker and had been a Cleveland Democrat, as a matter of fact, before the great Bryanite takeover. But he was not a Morgan person. He was definitely a Rockefeller person. He was a president of the First National Bank of Chicago before he became Secretary of the Treasury. And he was also a big corporatist, as we'll see. Weinstein. Start reading, by the way, in addition to Kogo, the first couple of chapters of Weinstein. It's especially dealing with the National Civic Federation, which was I think that's the first chapter. The big corporatist or corporate liberal institution moving towards statism, representing big business interests, an alliance with intellectuals and a few labor union leaders, moving towards state control, state regulation, etc. Gage was the head of the Chicago Civic Federation, which is the initial sort of the birth of the National Civic Federation. I'll get to that later. At any rate, he was former president of the American Banking Association, and the First National Bank of Chicago was essentially a subsidiary of the National City Bank, New York, closely allied to it, which of course was Rockefeller. When Gage leaves the Secretary of Treasury ship, the question is, always you have to look at what were these guys before they were Secretary of the Treasury, and what were they afterward? They didn't just pop out of thin air, didn't descend from heaven in a vacuum. So as I say, before that he was head of the First National Bank of Chicago, which was in the Rockefeller National City Bank ambit, and after he gets out of there, he becomes president of the U.S. Trust Company, which is a Rockefeller company, Rockefeller Stillman Company. The Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, you have to realize in those days there was no government departments were much smaller. There was no undersecretary, deputy secretary. There was just one assistant secretary, and that was it. It was a great era. So the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury was a certain Frank Vanderlip. In addition to being a banker, was also a pain-in-the-neck intellectual. I mean, always issuing reform pronouncements about banking. As we'll see. He's a theoretician, in other words. Frank Vanderlip, after leaving, what does he do after he leaves the Assistant Secretary of Treasury post? He becomes president of the National City Bank itself. In other words, the top Rockefeller man in the banking business. Okay? So you have a solid Rockefeller Treasury Department under McKinley. Secretary of War was Russell Alger of Michigan, who was the former governor, head of the Republican Party of Michigan, and a wealthy lumberman. And director of the U.S. Express Company, which is controlled by Boss Platt. We'll get to Boss Platt in a minute. So, as we'll see later, by the way, he was head of the Diamond Match Company, which is the main reason for Sherman Antitrust Act. We'll get to that later on. Anyway, Secretary of War was Russell Alger of Michigan. He was essentially an ally of Boss Platt. We'll see about Platt in a minute. And the Secretary of Navy, Massachusetts, John Davis Long, but he was the director of the U.S. Trust Company, which was Rockefeller. So once again, we have Rockefeller with certain Morgan connections, but I mean basically Rockefeller. The ambassador to Great Britain, which is also a very important post in the State and the Foreign Service, it still is, the top power elite post, was none other than Joe Choate, who was the top lawyer for Standard Oil and for Rockefeller personally. In other words, Rockefeller and Standard Oil. Okay, this the Speaker of the House. Now looking at the legislature, what McKinley was working with, the Congress, was Thomas Reed of Maine, who was a very close and old-time friend of Henry Rogers, who was one of the top Standard Oil executives, the Rogers family and Standard Oil Rockefeller. So Reed was essentially Rockefeller. Boss Platt, who was the friend of Alger, was the Republican boss of New York State. Boss Platt. Platt was an old high school chum and schoolmate and chum of John D. Rockefeller in Owego, New York. Before he moved to Cleveland, he was a couple of years in high school in Owego, upstate New York. It's a very good thing to have been a high school chum of Rockefeller, whether it's in Cleveland or New York. Okay, Rockefeller class chum. There's one other guy, his name I forget now, was also a pal of Rockefeller, because they're both teaching in Baptist Sunday school. I forget who that one was. Anyway, that was a good thing, too. The one way to get ahead in the world is to be a high school classmate of Rockefeller. Unfortunately, most of us are not going to make it. All right, the senator, the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, very powerful figure for many years, was a senator from Rhode Island, Nelson W. Aldrich. Nelson W. Aldrich entered the Senate in 1881 as a sort of a middle-class wholesale grocer, fairly well off, but not spectacular. He retired 30 years later. He died in office 30 years later with assets of $12 million, which is equivalent now to about $100 million. The question is, how did he do it? Because he didn't have a salary, wasn't very high. How did he get this money? It's like Lyndon Johnson spending all of his life as congressman and senator or president, winding up as a multimillionaire. Well, one thing is he bought the Rhode Island legislature. He got himself public utilities franchises are big, of course. Who gets the contract to have a electric company in Providence, Rhode Island? Either himself or his brother or his friends. So he essentially bought out the whole Rhode Island legislature. Anyway, who was he? So who was Senator Aldrich? Senator Aldrich happened to be the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr. In other words, if he can't be the high school chum of Rockefeller, be his father-in-law, would be the father-in-law of the son. So he's the father-in-law of John D. Jr., making him a distinguished member of the family. Abby Aldrich, whatever her name is. Governor Rockefeller died recently. Nelson Rockefeller, his middle name was Aldrich. In other words, he's named after a beloved family member and kinsman, Nelson Aldrich. His name is Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. Winthrop W. Aldrich, son of Nelson, became head of the Chase National Bank when Rockefeller took it over from the Morgans. And one great moment, sometime in the 1950s, I forget the exact year, it was a marvelous moment to see how the power elite really runs politics. Thomas Dewey, who was a beloved governor of New York for many years, was of course, really a tool of the Rockefeller machine. So one year he decided he was going to quit. He was tired of being governor. He wanted to make some money. He wanted to go into private law practice and make millions. He announced that he was going to quit. And the guy who would have been the Republican candidate was Lieutenant Governor Hanley, some upstate New Yorker, no prominent, and nobody knew anything about him. So obviously, either he'd lose or he wouldn't be important. He was called to the office. The New York World Telegram, a paper now gone, got a hold of the story and published it. He was called to the offices. In other words, Winthrop Aldrich, head of the Chase National Bank, member of the Rockefeller family, called Dewey into his offices for a meeting. And he issued a summons. Come, you will appear on next Thursday at noon. Dewey meekly appeared, and he ordered Dewey to run for re-election, and Dewey accepted it. It's very interesting. It sort of gives you a little window on what really happens in American politics. His master's voice, okay, yes, sir, I will run for governor again. They finally allowed him to retire after 4 more years or something. He finally made some money before he corked off. But in other words, the Republican Party in New York for many years was essentially a Rockefeller Party, and when Nelson actually ran for governor and then for president, it was an open drive for power by the family itself. As a matter of fact, John D. Sr. and his brother William. He had one son, John D. Jr., who died, I think either before Sr. or almost just a year or two afterward. And then there was the famous brothers, getting a little old now, but running things until very recently. Nelson, the political arm. David, who was head of the Chase Manhattan Bank, the financial power. Lawrence, who's in charge of recreation and land conservation. buys up resorts and then turns everything else over to public parks. There wouldn't be any competition. He's in charge of recreation. It's John D. Jr., John D. the Third or something. I forget what he's in charge. I guess it's just regular business. And then there was Winthrop, who sort of got drunk a lot, so they shipped him off to Arkansas. He became governor of Arkansas for a while. He sort of exiled him to Arkansas. The black sheep of the Rockefeller brothers. Now we have, of course, a whole bunch of Rockefellers, the cousins, as they're called, dozens of them. And of course, they all operate together. They have a family investment team, the Rockefeller brothers. At any rate, there's a certain, in this Rockefeller domination of the government, there's a certain sop to the Morgans. One of the sops slightly was John Hay, who became Secretary of State after Sherman. Hay was basically a Rockefeller person. He was a former journalist and another theoretician. You always have to watch out for theoreticians in politics. He was Secretary of State after 1899, in 98. He was from Cleveland, Ohio. He's an Ohio Republican and all the rest of it. His brother-in-law was Samuel Mather, was the big businessman in Cleveland, and he was also, however, connected also with the Morgan's Federal Steel Company. He had certain ties with the Morgans, which would do him in good stead later. At any rate, he was basically Rockefeller. And the Attorney General later on, 2 or 3 years into the administration, was a guy named Griggs from New Jersey, who was essentially a Morgan person. But basically, it was a solid Rockefeller administration. There was one, however, sop. What always happens is the other faction gets the vice presidential nomination. So the vice president under McKinley was a guy named Garrett Hobart, nobody, I'm sure none of you have ever heard of. Here he was, distinguished vice president of the United States, nobody's ever heard of him. Garrett A. Hobart, who was a Morgan man from New Jersey. He was a New Jersey politician, senator, and so forth and so on. And he was director of Morgan's Liberty National Bank of New York, and also in, I think, with Morton Salt Company, which is a Morgan company, and a couple of other Morgan directorates. So he was essentially in the Morgan stable. He was a New York Life Insurance Company, which is Morgan, and so he was the basic sop to the Morgans. In 1899, Garrett Hobart dies fairly young, I guess the age of 53 or something. And there's a vacancy for the Morgan person in the vice presidential nomination. McKinley, of course, is going to be renominated in 1900. He's going to win the landslide against the idiot Bryan, who's been put up again by Democrats. The question is, who should be vice president? And of course, it had to be a Morgan person. And it's a very fateful day because Morgan insisted, he offered it to almost everybody. Everybody in the Morgan camp. He offered it to Morgan himself. He offered it to Chauncey Depew, head of New York Central, wouldn't take it. And so the Morgans insisted, the only Morgan man who would take it was Theodore Roosevelt, whom everybody in the McKinley administration hated the guts of. They all thought he was nuts anyway. They said he's crazy, insane. There's a certain justification for that. I don't think he's crazy. He's certainly a wild man type. So we get to Theodore Roosevelt, who will be our next political discussion person here. We have to get to the merger stuff and how it failed. But then our next political discussion will be about Teddy Roosevelt. The thing you have to realize about who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he was the Morgan person in the Navy Department under Long. And when McKinley launched the war against Spain in 1898 for the possession of Cuba, Teddy Roosevelt sent a telegram when the Secretary was out of town commanding the admiral to start fighting. So he was not overruled by McKinley, but essentially he was an extreme war hawk then and later. As a matter of fact, he loved war for its own sake, Teddy Roosevelt. He was half blind, Teddy Roosevelt, but he always wanted to fight. And when he finally fought in the Spanish-American War, he led his troops up to the Rough Riders in Cuba, and he almost got shot. Everybody else got shot. His forces were decimated. It was a total disaster. The guy couldn't see. But anyway, he made it because he had a lot of influence in the press, and the Morgan-dominated press. He came out a big hero and rode that to the vice presidential nomination later. And the thing about the Roosevelt family, you have to realize there are two wings of the Roosevelt family, very, very different wings. One wing of the Oyster Bay Roosevelts come from Oyster Bay, Long Island, descendants of the two Roosevelt brothers back in the 17th century. First came here very early. This was, I think, John Roosevelt, the original 17th century Roosevelt. Moved to Oyster Bay. The whole Oyster Bay group, merchants and lots of other things, they were much wealthier generally. Cornelius Roosevelt, James A. Roosevelt, whatever. And then there was the Hyde Park Roosevelts. This was brother James back in the 17th century, settled in upstate New York, from which Franklin emerged. In other words, this is the Theodore Roosevelt branch of the family, and this is the Franklin branch. The Hyde Park branch got in very early with the Harrimans and the Astors, who were their neighbors, basically, and they became Harriman types, so to speak. Harriman, and of course, by extension, Kuhn, Loeb, and Rockefeller, starting in 1900. The Oyster Bay Roosevelts from early in the game in the late 19th century became Morgan-connected. See already the conflict, okay? Teddy Roosevelt's father and Uncle James, I forget his father's name anyway, both in with the Morgans financially. His Uncle James Roosevelt was director of the Dubuque and Sioux City, Iowa Railroad. I already told you it was Morgan until Harriman captured it, so to speak. His Uncle James was also director of the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad, which was a Vanderbilt Morgan Railroad. And so they grew up as Morgan people. As a matter of fact, two of Teddy Roosevelt's not only cousins, but very close financial advisors. One of them was W. Emlyn Roosevelt, who was a first cousin, but also a very close friend and financial advisor of Teddy before he became president, while he was president, and afterward. W. Emlyn was connected with a whole bunch of Morgan boards. The Astor National Bank, which was, his head was George Baker, a Morgan person. The Astor Trust Company, which is Morgan. And a member of the board of the Central and Southern American Telegraph Company, which is a very close Morgan thing. The board consisted of William P. Hamilton as a son-in-law of Morgan, Charles Lanier, was a longtime associate of Morgan, another guy who had married into the Vanderbilt family. In other words, W. Emlyn, close financial advisor and friend of Teddy, was very close to the Morgan ambit. And his other top friend and relative was Douglas Robinson, who was Teddy Roosevelt's brother-in-law, who was also was a real estate operator in New York, was also in the Astor Bank, also in the Morgan ambit. So we have, in other words, Teddy Roosevelt's whole family and friends, close friends and relatives were all tied in with the Morgan ambit from early on. So Teddy Roosevelt grew up as a Morgan person, so to speak, and as we'll see next time, or next time after that, continuing on, accelerated in the Morgan ambit. His first wife was a Boston financial person associated with a Morgan, et cetera, et cetera. The whole this grows. Okay, that's way over time, I'm afraid. Beginnings of Teddy Roosevelt. We'll be coming back to Teddy Roosevelt next time. His two major financial advisors, personal financial advisors all of his life were two close relatives. His first cousin, W. Emlyn Roosevelt. These are all Oyster Bay wing of the family, notice, not the Hyde Park wing. W. Emlyn was a member of the board of directors of many the Astor National Bank, which was Morgan through George Baker, the Central and Southern American Trading Company, on which board was also the son-in-law of J.P. Morgan, named Hamilton, and so forth. Then there's Douglas Robinson, who was Teddy Roosevelt's brother-in-law, who was a big real estate operator, and also on the same Morgan network. Later on, as we'll see, just to give you a teaser for later on, the real key to the Panama Canal caper, which was I did some work on when the Panama Canal treaty was signed, and where Teddy Roosevelt, it was kind of interesting. Panama was, I'm really skipping ahead a bit, but Panama was simply a section of Colombia. Okay, it was Colombia in South America, and Panama was up here in the peninsula. Originally, it was supposed to be a Nicaraguan canal, which fell through for some reason, and so the French had opened up a canal company called the Panama Canal Company, which was quasi-bankrupt. Really, was bankrupt. They had the yellow fever problem, which you've probably seen in the movies. There was lots of yellow fever there, and the mosquitoes and whatever. And they could never lick the problem, so they couldn't dig the canal. And at any rate, the United States was negotiating to get a Panama Canal Company with the French Panama Canal Company and the Colombian government. And I think they'd agreed, I think it was $30 million. I have to check back. But anyway, let's say $30 million that the United States government would give to French Panama Canal Company in return for the rights to operate a canal. The thing is, of course, they were really bankrupt. Probably shouldn't have gotten anything. Let's say they got $30 million. And the Colombian government said, no, we want to get a piece of the action here. And they insisted on $10 million out of the 30. In other words, the $10 million would go to the Colombian government, and 20 would go to the French Canal Company. Teddy Roosevelt at that point decided to organize a fake revolution in Panama. The person, the reason why I'm talking about this now is the person who was hired by the French Panama Canal Company to negotiate all this stuff was a guy named William Nelson Cromwell, and later became the major partner of Sullivan and Cromwell, now one of the top law firms in Wall Street. Anyway, Cromwell was hired for a huge sum to lobby for the interests of the Panama Canal Company. Essentially get $30 million instead of $20 million. So that was a big thing, of course. And Cromwell was sitting in the White House issuing the orders for Teddy Roosevelt, and then Roosevelt would sign them. And Cromwell essentially was running this whole operation. Created a fake revolution in Panama, organized and financed by the U.S. government, and by the Panama Railroad Company, which was an American company, through them. The U.S. Navy then threatening to intercept any Colombian ships. But you couldn't go overland, it's all jungle. So you had to go by sea to get from Colombia proper to Panama. And the U.S. Navy would shoot sink any ship, Colombian ship, would try to suppress the revolution. So essentially, it was a fake revolution. It was not a popular revolution by the Panama masses. There were no Panama masses. Essentially, the American agents down there, getting these people to revolt, create a phony independent state of Panama, which then signed the treaty with the U.S. government for $20 million to turn over the full $30 million to the Panama to the Panama Canal Company. The U.S. government's official line was the Colombian government was trying to hold us up, the American taxpayer, for an extra $10 million, but that was a total lie. What they were trying to do is give the whole $30 million to the French company rather than the $20 million. In other words, the whole idea would have been no extra amount of money to the American taxpayers. It would have question of who should get the $30 million. Should the whole $30 million go to the French Canal Company, or should $10 million of it go to the Colombian government? That was the real issue. So, anyway, Teddy Roosevelt created this fake revolution, and that's immediately recognized it, of course, 24 hours after they proclaimed the new Panama state. And the interesting issue was that most historians still haven't discovered, because there's an obscure book by a guy who was involved in this, who finally sets the whole thing straight. The question is, who was the French Panama Canal Company? It turns out the French Panama Canal Company, when they were going bankrupt or semi-bankrupt, all their shares were bought up by a syndicate headed by J.P. Morgan, including all the Morgan people, a couple of Rockefeller people, a couple of Kuhn people, a guy named Douglas Robinson, who was Teddy Roosevelt's brother-in-law, all involved in this operation. They bought the shares when the French Canal Company was bankrupt for just 50 cents on the dollar. And when the American government created the phony Panama Revolution and gave the whole $30 million to the French Panama Canal Company, they doubled the value of their shares. They sold it at double the amount. In other words, they held the shares for a year, the Morgan syndicate, and then double their price by then selling it. So they got a lot of money out of this. It was the Morgan people. So essentially the whole operation, the whole Panama Revolution was a Teddy Roosevelt-Morgan deal. And most of the money that the syndicate got out of it was invested in New York City real estate, with Robinson as the real estate broker and landowner. So much of it was funneled into Robinson. So this is still not known to most historians of the Panama Canal Company. And if you're interested in a book on this, a guy named Earl Harding wrote a book called The Untold Secrets of Panama. Earl Harding was when he wrote this book, he was 80 years old. He was a former young reporter for the New York World Telegram, Scripps Howard, New York World, I should say, which exposed this about 1910. And Teddy Roosevelt, I think he was still president, maybe 1908, filed a libel suit for criminal libel against the New York World to try to suppress this information. And seditious libel. And it went to the Supreme Court and they said it's unconstitutional. There's no such thing as seditious libel against the president, the government. But Harding was a young reporter who did most of the work on that, and he finally, about 60 years later, disclosed the fact, or 50 years later. Anyway, this is the untold story of Panama. The whole thing is not only engineered by Teddy Roosevelt, which is generally accepted, but done in order to benefit the Morgan Syndicate, and his brother-in-law was connected with it. That's what I mean by being in the Morgan ambit, one of the things. Okay, getting to industry, we're getting now to the merger movement. And before I get to that, I want to just mention the fact that dealing with federal politics and industry in this period, that the iron and steel industry has always been, since 1820, the big major fountainhead of protective tariff movement. And largely because much of it is inefficient. And so they're always trying to keep out cheap foreign iron and steel. In 1820, which was the first organized protective tariff movement in the country, it was started by Representative Henry Baldwin of Pittsburgh, congressman from Pittsburgh, who himself was a big iron manufacturer, with Pittsburgh being the center of the iron and steel industry for a century or so. And after the Civil War, the big propagandist for protective tariff from about 1815 on was a guy named Matthew Carey. He was a Philadelphia printer. We also, of course, especially wanted to get a protective tariff on printing, on printing, sale of printing from newsprint, etc., from abroad. His son, Henry C. Carey, becomes an economist and the major lobbyist and propagandist for protective tariff. Carey became himself a Pennsylvania iron manufacturer and was the big theoretician for the iron and steel interests during the whole, after 10 or 15 years after the Civil War period. The interesting thing about the Civil War, post-Civil War period is that you had a situation where you had, as I said, greenbacks, in other words, fiat money, which was not redeemable in gold or silver. You had fiat money, inflationary fiat money, for the first time, really, and then you had protective tariff. And Carey, as a theoretician of this, saw immediately that you benefit, the U.S. steel industry benefits twice from having inflation plus a protective tariff. In other words, you have fiat money and protective tariff, and inflation, and acts like a double protective tariff. In other words, here you have the American dollar. As you inflate dollars, the quantity of dollars, the value of the dollar in terms of foreign currencies goes down. In other words, you have floating exchange rates as you have now. If the United States inflates, this lowers the value of the dollar. Okay? As you lower the value of the dollar, say the American dollar, let's say the American dollar used to be worth 4 francs, 4 French francs, let's say, right? So if you lower the American, if you inflate dollars and you raise prices, you lower the value of the dollar, let's say to 2 francs. Okay? This means that now the dollar is worth less abroad, so Americans can't buy as much. French prices are now much higher in the United States in terms of francs. American prices are lower in terms of dollars. So inflation, when you have fluctuating exchange rates, inflation acts as a subsidy to exports, to U.S. exports, and a tax on American imports. So, in other words, essentially what inflation does, when reflected in foreign currency, is you subsidize American exporters at the expense of American consumers. It's really a roundabout but effective manner of screwing the American consumer for the benefit of the American exporter. So that we can't buy foreign steel because it's more expensive, or any other foreign product. In the meantime, American exports become cheaper. So we are then stimulated to buy American iron and steel because we can't buy foreign products that become too expensive. This is why American exporters in any country always want inflation. If the inflation is reflected in falling exchange rates. This is why, by the way, the whole gang got together recently, about 3 months ago, gang by the United States government and all other governments, Western European governments, to try to push the dollar down, as you remember. The dollar had been magnificently expensive. I am going to Europe in a couple of weeks. This is always my luck, by the way. When I go to Europe, the dollar is always at its weakest. So if I go on last year, the dollar was worth like £1 almost. And now I think it's $1.50 per pound. English pounds and all the rest. They all got together to drive the dollar down in order to shaft the American consumer for the benefit of American exporters, basically. And so So the iron and steel people were getting, in other words, Carey and the iron and steel people realized if they get a protective tariff, it benefits, of course, it subsidizes American steel, and also inflation and greenbacks subsidize them. So you have a double subsidy. Now, historians used to believe, until about the 1950s, I say, the standard historical view was that inflation was always, the farmers are always pushing for inflation, and manufacturers and merchants are always in favor of hard money. This doesn't work that way at all. As a matter of fact, what happened in this period, for example, was the iron and steel manufacturers, are very powerful in the Republican Party, in particular, favored both greenback inflation and protective tariffs. And the Republican Party, as I said, and part of it was due to the pietist support, but this was the economic argument for it. In other words, the elite industrialist types, big business types, favored inflation because they realized that greenbacks, the dollar always could go down faster than American prices would go up, and they were therefore in great shape. And so it took until 1879 before we got back to the gold standard, and the Republicans fought against it. Yeah.
When inflation occurs, greenback, like you gave an example, dollar went
Yeah.
to 4,000.
Right.
What is the step to do?
Right. No, exporters like it when the dollar is very cheap. The dollar, let's say, is worth only 2 francs, because it means that exporters, American goods now are cheap in terms of foreign currency. Right? In other words, if the dollar is worth very little, it means that American prices become cheaper in terms of France or Germany or England or whatever. Right? Yeah, in the foreign country.
The dollar is high.
Yeah.
They can make more profit from this dollar.
Yeah, if the dollar is high, then America start importing more. Exactly, right. So exporters are always in favor of a cheap dollar. Importers are in favor of an expensive dollar. Nicely. Consumers always benefit. The average consumer always benefits when the dollar is very high, because it means we get cheap foreign products. And so, in order to shaft us, it works like another tariff. We can't buy as much abroad, and we have to turn therefore to inefficient American producers. So it acts as if cheap dollar acts as if equivalent to a tariff. I mean, you see how it works. It's sort of like a double tariff coming on. Makes dollars artificially cheap. You balance that. But there's no. First of all, each individual country doesn't need a balance. If you have any balance at all, it should be overall, a whole balance of payments. You can import stuff from Japan and then export stuff to other countries. The whole balance is that overall. So you don't have to have an equal balance of payments for each country. That was refuted by the 18th century. That kind of nonsense went out with about 1720. But even the overall balance now is irrelevant, because since there's no gold standard, you don't pay anything. In other words, see, there's a lot of complaint about the fact that America spends about $150 billion more in imports than we sell in exports overall. But see, what happens to $150 billion? It doesn't flow out of the country. It doesn't disappear somewhere, because nobody else uses dollars. Basically, what it means is the foreigners are willing to invest $150 billion worth in dollars and hold them, which really means buying investments in the United States, either real estate or stocks or bank accounts or bonds or something. There's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, it's great from the point of view of America. It means that foreigners are willing to invest in our cheap imports. Super. I hope that continues. It's not going to continue forever. As long as it does, it's like a great bonanza. You know? It's as if they're helping us, they're financing us with cheap food and whatever, cheap products. And they're holding dollars for various reasons. Much of it is because the United States is the safest country to invest in. You know, you're not going to get confiscated, for example. It's always important. You know, some new dictator's not going to come along and suddenly grab your dough. Okay? There's not going to be hyperinflation, we presume. And so, in the last few years, there's been a big increase in foreign investments in the United States, which is great. I mean, as I say, they should flow in. The United States had an overall deficit in the balance of payments the entire 19th century. Basically, Englishmen were financing American railroads and all sorts of other stuff. You know, it's great. It helps everybody. It's no big injury. Especially there's no gold standard, there's no problem about banks collapsing or anything. There's no problem at all. There's nothing actually flowing out, since it's somehow leaking out of the system. So the whole thing is trumped up by exporters who want to subsidize their exports. Basically what it is. Anyway, so Carey's sort of an interesting figure. Older in 1860s, 70s or so, he was holding what was called Carey Vespers. Once a week at his home, palatial home, he would have top-level elite people would come in the evening, and he would hold forth sort of his own private seminar. And the members of the seminar were mostly iron manufacturers called iron masters. Joseph Wharton of Philadelphia. Thomas Scott was also vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Representative Morrell is a big shot Careyite. Eber Ward is a very wealthy, Eber Ward, I should say, president of the Iron and Steel Association. These are the people hanging around Carey and getting the theoretical poop that they can then propagandize for what? For protective tariffs and greenback inflation. So in other words, behind the greenback and inflation agitation, not just pietists and farmers and general crazies, but also at the power elite stage, iron manufacturers knew exactly what they were doing. We're getting economic benefits from this. By the way, Carey is an interesting character because it also fits in with the whole pietist versus liturgical personally. Matthew Carey, his father was an Irish Catholic immigrant. Henry Carey, he got to be a big shot, converted to Protestantism, forgot his Irish, not only his Catholic background, his Irish background, became assimilated and also, of course, a Protestant pietist. He also had tremendous influence, Henry Carey, on Friedrich List, who was a German immigrant at one point, who came to the United States and imbibed the protective tariff doctrine and then brought it back to Germany. It was in many ways responsible for the whole protectionist movement in Germany. So it shows international flow of influence. Carey was also a friend of a columnist from the New York Tribune, Henry Greeley, who was a socialist pietist. Again, they kind of both, of course, agreeing on protective tariff as being a key element. And also another guy I must mention here is a kind of charming character I think I might have mentioned before. The major political arm of this guy in Congress was Representative William D. Kelly of Pennsylvania. He was also I think was an iron manufacturer himself. Anyway, he had the nickname of Pig Iron. He's known as Pig Iron Kelly because of his undying fealty to the iron and steel interests. Hi there, Pig Iron. Anyway, that was his general nickname. Okay, we get now to the merger movements of the late 19th century. One thing I should say also, the merger movements, which are both ideological and economic, in the sense that businessmen or manufacturers became convinced that the way to get a monopoly price, they tried it with cartels and it didn't work, the railroads didn't work. They figured it's better to if you really have a merger, then at least you won't have internal cheating. Okay? In other words, if you have 8 companies all refining sugar, let's say, or producing glucose, the 8 companies band together in one company, then you can't have one company cheating and under secret price cutting because there will be one company. In other words, a merger becomes presumably an easier way of arriving at a cartel price than having a cartel. So in other words, then you can push the supply to the left and raise prices without worrying about going up the industry demand curve, without worrying about individual companies cheating. A cartel is also one of the interesting aspects of the Antitrust Act, which comes in 1890, for reasons I'll go into in a minute, so-called Sherman Antitrust Act. Which in essence outlawed cartels. That means they go into mergers, which are even worse from the point of view of the consumer, because it means you're eliminating cartels. At least will fall apart very easily in a free market. If you have a merger, it's more difficult to fall apart. So the result of the Antitrust Act, in a sense, was to stimulate mergers. But another thing about the Antitrust Act is it was really a dead letter. It was not enforced until Teddy Roosevelt came in by 1902. In other words, all during the 1990s, even though it was on the books, it was generally known as not being enforced. And the great merger movement of 1898, 1901, and 1900, when these mergers were being put together, no corporate lawyer worried about the antitrust law. Nobody said, gee, we have to worry about the Sherman Act. It was a dead letter. It was considered, sort of a dead law which nobody paid attention to. The reason the Sherman Act came in, by the way, is kind of interesting. You can figure, here's a big business group, the Republican Party dominated by big business. Why are they putting through an Antitrust Act? So they suddenly get religion or whatever. What happened was this. Well, two factors. The personal factor, which we should never omit in history. Senator Sherman always wanted to be president. He was getting pretty old by this time. His last shot was 1888. It was the Republican Convention in 1888, which, as we know, Benjamin Harrison came through the nomination and won the presidency in 1888. It was an open convention. There was no one favorite. As a matter of fact, Harrison was sort of a dark horse. There were a lot of ballots in those days. Harrison came in with whatever it is, 28 ballots or something. So Sherman was running for president. One of the people running against him was General Russell Alger, who I've already mentioned. I think it was McKinley cabinet later, governor of Michigan and head of the Michigan Party. Alger was trying to get the nomination. Alger was also chairman of the board, I think, of the Diamond Match Company, which is, those days at least, was a, quote, monopoly, unquote. I think it was the only match-producing company, maybe in the world, certainly in the United States. So General Alger played dirty pool. He was competing with the same sort of delegates as Sherman. He bought out a lot of Sherman delegates. I mean, literally bribed them. I mean, Sherman, let's say, had 25 delegates pledged to him. And he found out when he gets to the convention he only has 15. The other 10 have been bought out by Alger. He's very bitter at Alger, Sherman, from then on. He was convinced that Alger deprived him of the nomination. So Sherman was out to get Alger. When Diamond Match Company gets under state antitrust problems after that in Michigan, Sherman gets up there on the floor of Congress and reads the entire, I think there's some Michigan court which said the Diamond Match Company was violating common law antitrust. And Sherman's there cackling at the decision, reads the whole decision in the congressional record, cackling every time they attack Alger and the Diamond Match Company. So when President Harrison signed the Sherman Act, he turned to his secretary and said, he chuckled. He said, "I see Senator John Sherman has gotten the Russell Alger." In other words, this was Sherman's revenge against Alger. He figured if he passed the Sherman Act, if any company is broken up under, it'll be a Diamond Match Company. So the idea was to smash Alger. This was Sherman's personal shtick. And interestingly enough, when the Orthodox historian of the history of the Sherman Act, the crummy book is the only good, full books written on by Hans Torelli, and he gets to this point, this charge. He has a footnote on this. A charge that Sherman did this in order to pass it in order to try to get back at Alger. And he said, "I couldn't believe that any American statesman had this kind of a petty motive." That's supposed to dispose of the charge. Now, those of us who believe that American statesmen are capable of petty motives have a different view of it. At any rate, the reason why the Republican Party passed it in general, not just Sherman, of course, there's another broader reason for this, namely that the Democrats kept charging, as we'll see in a minute, their big argument against the tariff was that the tariff is the mother of trusts. In other words, it was a phrase that was stated by Henry Havemeyer, the great sugar trust person. And the Democrats then repeated this. The tariff is the mother of trusts. In other words, it's impossible to have any cartel or any trust or any merger system that's going to work at all unless you have a protective tariff which keeps out foreign competition, which creates a wall so that you can have a monopoly price. Right? In other words, you won't be able to have a cartel arrangement restricting production and pushing out prices unless you keep out cheaper foreign imports, create a wall to enforce the tariff. So therefore, the foreign tariff is the only way a trust can work, or a monopoly or cartel can work at all, is if you keep out foreign competition. And as a matter of fact, when you read in the old days, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, you used to read attacks on American business being monopolistic. They say 3 companies have an 80% share of the market, but the share was only American companies. You have to leave out all foreign producers. General Motors and Ford were supposed to be a duopoly of the American automobile industry. It was only a duopoly. In other words, it's only a two-firm industry. If you leave out Honda and Toyota and everybody else, and Mercedes, if you leave out imports, it looks like a big monopoly concentration. If you realize that you can always import stuff, you have a completely different picture. The Democrats, the laissez-faire Democrats, had a very effective charge against the tariff, namely, it's the mother of trusts. The Republicans committed to the protective tariff, said, okay, we'll shut them up. We'll shut up the Democrats by saying, we're going to break up trusts. We're going to go you one better. We're not going to just create trust. It's true, even if we'll create trust by the tariff, and then we'll break them up. So that was the way they could answer the Democrats' charges and have the Sherman Act on the books. As we'll see later, when Teddy Roosevelt began to enforce this, the thing became part of a titanic struggle between the Rockefeller and the Morgan financial empires, breaking up the other guys' companies, using antitrust law as the ideological weapon. Okay, well, before we get to that, we have to talk about the merger movements, the great merger movements of 1898 and 1901. And the idea was this: if business is big, a bigger business is better. If a big business is more efficient, which in many cases it was, why don't we have one firm for the entire industry, and then we can cut production and raise prices? That was the whole. And literally hundreds of industries did this in this one small period, 1888, 1901. Cocoa deals with a lot of that. I, again, commend you to read first chapter of Cocoa and also the first chapter of Weinstein, dealing with the National Civic Federation. First two chapters of Cocoa deal with this at length. I'm going to repeat some of this and deal with a couple of others. In the iron and steel industry, for example, in 1889, there were 719 iron and steel companies in the United States. And there were constant attempts all during the 1880s and 90s at pools and cartels to restrict production and raise prices. They didn't work. All flopperoos. And finally, there's a series of mammoth mergers. Okay, we'll merge everybody. And finally, in 1901, the mammoth U.S. Steel Corporation is founded. The idea of U.S. Steel was it was supposed to be a monopoly of the entire steel industry. That was the objective, to include every steel company. It was put through, of course, by J.P. Morgan and Company, financed, underwritten, and organized by Morgan, and also including Carnegie. By this time, Carnegie was getting old and he wanted to sell out. I mean, literally sell out. He wanted to retire. He makes a deal with Morgan. So it includes Morgan, Carnegie, Schwab, all these people. And the idea, as I said, was to have them try to get 100% of the steel industry. By 1899, there were still, even with a bunch of mergers, 668 steel companies. And in February 1901, they set up U.S. Steel. By the way, I should mention here one of the key Morgan partners, which put most of these things together, the major merger partner and the major political partner, George W. Perkins, very important figure for the Morgans. And George W. Perkins. And so you have in this, you have the chairman of the board of U.S. Steel was Judge Gary, a famous figure in the steel industry who was, all these are Morgan people. Judge Gary, I forget his first name, Oaken or something like that, Elbert, I think Elbert. And the idea is to kind of merge all of them. They weren't able to merge all of them. Once again, there's no government coercion here. There's no government saying you have to merge. So they wind up, U.S. Steel, merging 138 companies. Still an impressive number. With 60% of the iron and steel market. Okay? In other words, U.S. Steel starts with 60% share of the iron and steel business. And you'd think, you see, if you believe in the most people think, well, big business can always outcompete small business. It doesn't work. Not at all. But especially if it's an artificial kind of thing like this. And as I said about Rockefeller, Standard Oil couldn't see the importance of gasoline. They couldn't see the importance of Texas crude and all the rest of it. Well, U.S. Steel has been a flopperoo from the very beginning. It's been heartwarming to those of us who are in favor of competitive markets. U.S. Steel has been a total flopperoo from the beginning until the present time. In other words, it's always been a crummy company. It started as a crummy company. It's still a crummy company. It's been its share of the market has been declining steadily since 1901. It's been losing money most of the time. It lost an enormous amount of money for its promoters. In other words, for the initial stockholders lost money throughout. The only people who made money was Morgan and his people. Because if you're an underwriter, you're a promoter, you get money off the top. You get a big fee putting the whole thing together. Then the suckers who buy the stock are stuck. So, as the last company to put in innovations, the U.S. Steel was the last company in the world to put in the oxygen process, whatever the current one is, basic oxygen process, I think it's called. It started, again, in Europe with small companies, and other companies took it up. U.S. Steel was the most monopolist, the most backward company, et cetera, et cetera. And it started, for example, as a share of the market. U.S. Steel share of ingots and castings, which was a major product. In 1901, it had 63% of the market. It kept declining until 1920s, 46% of the market. 1950s, it was 32% of the market. It's probably undoubtedly less now. I mean, 1955 is the last figure I have for this, but it's steadily declining. Every aspect, ingots and castings, pig iron, wire and nail, it's the same story. overall total for the whole business, 1901 was 62% total. In 1920, it was 40% of the market. So, again, partly due to technological conservatism. You got a big company like that, swollen, artificially big, so to speak. They're slow in adopting new inventions. In 1900 to 1919, for example, a big shift in the industry was from Bessemer steel to open hearth steel. Again, it starts in small companies. U.S. Steel continued as Bessemer until almost the end. Continued and stuck in their old technology. Also, as the time went on in the 1920s, the shift was from start with heavy steel products. Later you get lighter and lighter steel, structural steel, so forth and so on. U.S. Steel is the last company to start going into these new fields. Stuck with it. We always produce heavy steel, that sort of thing. They're behind in the scrap metal field and alloys, stainless steel, the last steel company to adopt stainless steel, the continuous rolling mill, the whole bit. Structural steel, they didn't think that was important either. So they're constantly, you start off with lots of plants, you're sort of stuck with those obsolete plants. You're not geared to new equipment because you're stuck with these 50 plants with older equipment. U.S. Steel was a holding company operation. You sort of have 10 quasi-independent companies with stocks were merged into U.S. Steel Company. So it's a very inefficient way of doing it anyway. The shares of U.S. Steel the share prices reflect of this. For example, U.S. Steel started 1901. The price of each share on the stock market was $55. So you say, hey, this is a new monopoly. They're going to make lots of money, right? So you buy their shares for $55 a piece. By 1904, they're going down to $9 a share. Typical of the U.S. Steel and work. And their profits dropped precipitously. 1902, they had 16% profits. By 1904, they had 7% profits. And they kept the price of steel low. Another thing is they found out, even with mergers, it works the same as cartels in a sense. If you raise the price, you're going to induce other companies to come in. You have new competitors. You still can't keep out the new competitors without government coercion. They were afraid to raise the price of steel. They had to keep it low anyway, and their costs were high because they were an inefficient company. So their profits started going down very rapidly. So what the reaction then was, well, Judge Gary, the beloved leader, chairman of the board of the U.S. Steel Company, organized what were called Gary Dinners, 1907, 1908. These were dinners, banquets, which included all the steel and the top industrialists in the iron and steel industry. And they got together and they said, let's raise the price. The idea was to cut production and raise price. Let's have a cartel again because U.S. Steel's share of the market was declining anyway. And they said, yes, we'll do it. Yes, we should cut production, raise price. Right, we all agree, and then they go out and cut prices some more. Take advantage while the other suckers are raising their price. I'm going to lower mine. So the Gary dinners, 20 guys got together at dinner, and they agree and make an agreement. They break it within 3 months. So once again, mergers didn't work. And instead of that, you had price cuts, you had intense competition, recrimination and hatred because they broke the agreement, and that sort of stuff. So informal cartels, once again, didn't work. It had nothing to do with antitrust laws that were not applied to this. And only in World War I, as we'll see later on in the course, where culminated organized cartelism by the federal government, was the government able to cartelize the system. So at any rate, as I said, in recent years, the U.S. Steel was the last company to adopt the basic oxygen process, which was one of the latest technological advances. In 1909, by the way, after this attempt at a merger, and after this cartels and breakage of the cartels, in 1909 there was still 654 iron and steel companies. After all this frantic attempts at a merger, they're still stuck with over 600 companies. So this is a record. This flopperoo of U.S. Steel was repeated literally almost hundreds of times throughout every industry. Almost every attempted merger was a flop, a very quick flop. I'm going to quote from Coco. I usually don't do this, you're supposed to read it, but I think it's an important quote. It's page 39 of Coco, summing this up. Quote, "The steel industry was competitive before the World War, and the efforts of the House of Morgan to establish control and stability," he calls it control and stability, I would call it cartel, of course. controlling the cartel over the steel industry by voluntary private economic means had failed. Having failed in the realm of economics, I'll underline this, write this on the board 20 times if I could. Having failed in the realm of economics, the efforts of the U.S. Steel Group were to be shifted to politics. As far as I'm concerned, this sums up the entire progressive period from 1900 to 1918. Namely, big businesses, especially Morgan's, try to establish cartels and mergers and monopoly prices in the free market. They couldn't do it. Every time it was a flop roast, so they turned to the government to do it for them in the name of welfare state, warfare state, national planning, all the other nonsense. The names don't matter. The real point is, if they couldn't achieve monopolies and cartels in the free market, they turned to government to do it for them. But the government, they couldn't do it in the name of establishing a monopoly. They couldn't say to the public, we want a monopoly, we want a cartel, we want the government to enforce it. They had to say this is democracy, this is modernization, it's bringing us into the modern world, and all the rest of the junk. They had to use different ideologies. But the essence of the process was to politicize the system in order to cartelize it. They had to call it expanding democracy and all that. We'll see as time goes on. I'm just stating the fact, and I'm going to demonstrate this time and again as we get to the progressive period. In other words, what we've been dealing with so far is up to 1900. When we get to the progressive era, this will become more evident. And so by 1900, also, business sentiment in general was swinging. Business begins to realize, when these mergers begin to flop, they begin to realize they have to turn to the government to enforce cartels and mergers for them. That's the point. So what happens is every time the U.S. Steel organizes a merger and pushes things up a bit, new steel firms come into the picture. You see, they say, steel prices are going up, we'll compete. They come in with better new equipment, they outcompete U.S. Steel, and the price goes down again, and they're back with new firms, 654 firms, lower prices and lower profits. There's no percentage in that. And then they have to buy out the competitor, and it costs a lot of money to buy out a new profitable competitor. So it's sort of like rolling back the ocean. You can't do it. As Iron Age, the magazine of the Iron and Steel Association, said in September 1900, it's especially true, in other words, to try to buy up a new firm coming in, but a combination, namely U.S. Steel, is naming confessedly high prices for its goods, and is at the same time under heavy expenses on account of buying out competitors or subsidizing them to keep out of the market. So it's like an endless loss process. You try to maintain a high price, a new competitor comes in, you try to buy them out, you're spending money like water, you're making losses. Okay, so that was the Iron and Steel Trust. This is repeated time and time again in other companies. The Whiskey Trust, for example. You get the whiskey. 80 small Midwestern firms in 1887 combined into the Distillers, Cattle, and Feeders Trust. Try to have a whiskey trust, a whiskey monopoly. 1887. In the Middle West. As I say, in the late 1890s is the peak of this, but it starts, earlier than that. And they have 21 plants. They bring them to cut production and raise price immediately. They keep the price of whiskey up for a few years. And of course, new whiskey distilleries come in. What the hell? You can't keep them out. So new firms come in. The Distillers Trust buys them up, and they finally go bankrupt. They can't keep buying stuff. They haven't got unlimited funds to buy up new distilleries. And so in 1896, this cartel goes bust. That was the end of that. They tried again by 1903, and it doesn't work either. The same thing happened with kind of a charming company, the National Biscuit Company. National Biscuit Company, as you all know, is the producers of different packaged biscuits. But they were the first ones to do it. See, in the old days, you didn't have packages. There were no packages. You go into a general store and you buy, there's bins with stuff in it, bins with Malamars. It's probably that way in Europe now, in Asia, right? And you get, it's kind of charming. You get these, I want 20 Malamars or something. So the National Biscuit Company is the first company to package, I think they package almost anything, not just cookies or crackers. I think it might have been the first retail packaging of food. And, because you can imagine how if people wanted the poison bins, it would be much more effective than Tylenol. I mean, there's no package at all. It just had bins of stuff in it. Anyway, you had National Biscuit Company and so forth. You needed biscuit, I think, was the first one. And this, of course, is a big hit because it means the customers can now buy, you know what you're getting, and you're getting a certain fixed amount, and so forth and so on. The National Biscuit Company was originally supposed to be a monopoly. In 1888, 98, they formed with a giant regional combination of 3 other giant regional combinations. They want to have a big monopoly of the entire biscuit field, entire cookie and biscuit field. And they try to then cut production and raise prices. And as soon as they did it, this was in 1898, as soon as they did it, new companies kept coming in. They had to buy them up. Well, you can't, it's too expensive to buy it up. Where are they going to get the money from? And finally the whole thing collapses. They almost go bankrupt. And in 1901, the National Biscuit Company, I wish I used to have the quote from this, the charming quote from the National Biscuit Company report. I still have it here. Where they say they're changing their policy. Yeah, here it is. They're giving up the idea of a monopoly and they're going to just go to competition. This is their annual report of 1901. It's in a book by Alfred Chandler on big business in America, a sort of a paperback book. They're announcing the change. Why this is before antitrust, by the way. I mean, the antitrust was not being enforced. Nothing to do with this. After 3 years of this, trying to have a monopoly and constantly being outcompeted, almost going bankrupt, they issue a report to their stockholders changing their whole policy. This is what they say. It's charming. Quote, when we look back over the 4 years, 1898 to 1901, when we look back over the 4 years, we find that a radical change has been wrought in our methods of business. When this company started, it was thought we must control competition. In other words, have a cartel, have a monopoly. And that to do this, we must either fight competition or buy it. This first meant, was fighting it, a ruinous war of prices and a great loss of profit. The second, the constantly increasing capitalization, and we're constantly spending more money to buy up new competitors. Experience soon proved to us that instead of bringing success, either of these courses, if persevered in, must bring disaster. This led us to reflect whether it was necessary to control competition at all, in other words. We soon satisfied ourselves that within the company itself we must look for success. We turned our attention and bent our energies to improving the internal management of our business, to getting full benefit from purchasing our raw materials in large quantities, to economizing the expenses of manufacture, to systematizing and rendering more effective our selling department, and above all things and before all things, it's beautifully written, as a matter of fact, not like most stockholder reports, and above all things and before all things, to improve the quality of our goods and the condition in which they should reach the customer. It became the settled policy of this company to buy out no competition. So it's a beautiful, clear statement. They tried monopoly, it didn't work, and now they're going to compete, they're going to cut costs and try to improve their product and forget about trying to get a monopoly. This is repeated in really every industry in this whole period. Agriculture machinery, the same way. Agriculture machinery, Morgan and Perkins got together to try to get a monopoly in farm equipment manufacturing. McCormick was the leading farm equipment manufacturer, McCormick Reaper. McCormick, I guess, was retiring or dying, except the original McCormick. They decided to get together and merge all farm equipment manufacturing into one giant Morgan-type monopoly called International Harvester, which was formed in 1902. It was supposed to be the only company in the farm equipment business. And once again, of course, other companies didn't go along with it. New companies came in to outcompete. Again, Morgan and Perkins and the McCormicks. And so they formed in 1902 a giant alleged monopoly. From the very beginning, they were singularly unprofitable, International Harvester. The management was no good. The ore was bad. They were overconfident. Their share of their profits declined from the very beginning, and their share of the market declined, their share of output. I'll let you go in a minute for a break. But for example, International Harvester began, I get this, for example, with binders, which is one of the top farm machinery. Okay, binders. International Harvester begins in 1903 with 96% of the market. Now think about that. Not like U.S. Steel with 60. 96% of the market. By 1911, they're down to 87% and counting downward. In other words, they lose money from the very beginning. They lose business shares. Mowers drops from 91% to 75%, and harvesters themselves dropped from 85% to 80, and then finally 64% by 1918. So all of these are constantly declining. They start almost a monopoly. They almost get their monopoly, almost, but not quite, and then I keep going. And even in 1909, there were still 640 farm equipment manufacturing companies in the United States. 640, excuse me. Even small ones, but the point is they're able to compete, and if an international harvester tries to raise the price and cut production, they can be outcompeted very easily. And total farm machinery, by 1922, as a total, international harvesters down to 44%. They start with about 90, okay, in 1902. By 1922, they got 44%. By 1948, they had 23%. It's been declining, in other words, steadily ever since they started. They started with a virtual monopoly. They keep falling constantly since then. Again, they're behind in a lot of stuff. They were behind in rubber tires, things like that, you know. They stay stuck with the old stuff till quite late. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break and we'll press on these industries, which we won't be able to do full credit to until maybe later. But one of the most important industries in the country is, of course, the automobile industry. And I just want to say, there's a very interesting new book. If you're interested in pursuing history of technology in particular, American technology, it's by a guy named Hounshell, David Hounshell. It's in paperback. It's a terrible title. I think Princeton University Press, Johns Hopkins, one of the top presses, I think Princeton. It's called From the American System to Mass Production. And it's sort of technological history revisionism. It's a whole new field. And from the American system to mass production. Okay. And it's a very interesting book. It's a history of American technology and manufacturing. And what he points out, there are several revisionist things he points out. He points out that, for example, most people have thought, until this book came out last year, really, I mean, it's sort of summarizing the latest stuff in the field. Most historians thought that mass production came in around 1850s, 1860s. Mass production meaning factories, interchangeable parts, particularly. Instead of handcrafting each part to fit together, it all becomes all the parts are identical, and then you can replace them easily. Okay. It turns out it's not really true. Real mass production and interchangeable parts only came in much later. So that many of the things we think of as being true mass production really weren't. For example, the McCormick Reaper, the Singer sewing machine, which comes in about 1880s or so. McCormick Reaper, which comes in also that period, was not really, the parts were not interchangeable. The parts were hand-fitted. Even though they're machines, they had craftsmen, artisans, who hand-fitted, very skilled, expensive work, of course, to hand-fit all the parts together. And so it still keeps on, even with McCormick Agricultural, even though they were large, with mass production in the sense of a large amount of production per year, it was very costly. It still wasn't very cheap because it was hand-fitted by artisans and mechanics. And the thing is, these mechanics would go from one industry to another, carrying their craft with them, so to speak. And it's only really with Henry Ford and when the mass production really comes in with interchangeable parts in 1910. The whole concept of completely identical parts, we don't need mechanics or artisans to hand-fit. And one of the major ancestor, and one interesting thing of the way this fits is, in order to produce the automobile, the preliminary work to producing the automobile was done by the bicycle industry, which comes in only in 1890s, 1880s, 1890s. Before that, there were no bicycles. Not only were there no roads and no cars and no bicycles. Bicycles really come in like 1860 or 70. But the kind of bicycle that was popular in Europe and then came to the United States was not really suitable for much. It was sort of like this, and it was a big front wheel and teeny back wheel, and no chain-driven links between them. So it was very dangerous. You're sitting up on top here, you topple over at any minute. Okay, so it wasn't really. It was sort of a toy for the rich. It was very expensive and very much unused. It was in the only the 1890s when the so-called safety bicycle was produced. Not only even wheels, but also chain-linked, okay? Chain-driven. This is with pedals, all the rest of it we're not familiar with. And the first guy to really do this in the United States is a guy named Alexander Pope. Arthur Pope, we have the Pope Bicycle Company. And this became extremely popular in the United States. I think in the 1890s, 100,000, 200,000 bicycles were used. It was a mass production. In other words, mass production and safe and mass production, and people driving around, everybody buying a bicycle. With everybody buying a bicycle, they got used to the idea of moving on their own hook. In other words, before that, in order to move around, you have to have a train. Okay, basically, the trains had fixed schedules, and the trains were the only way to move from one city to another, one area to another. As I said, there's no land transportation except trains, right? So what you have is the cities get built up. Everything gets built around the train station. The train station is in the middle of town. Now, how do you get, and factories, everybody wants to be near the train station. Factories, in order to get their raw materials shipped and ship their stuff out. And workers and people living near the factories, you have to walk. There's no way to get, there's no cars, there's no bicycles, there's no nothing. So everybody has to walk to work. Okay, so the cities grow up as clustered around train station. And so cities become this kind of a circular sort of area around the train station, clustered in. And movement can only take place as mass transit, so to speak, in fixed schedules and fixed terminals. All of a sudden, the bicycle comes in, as a safety bicycle comes in, where suddenly people get the feeling, boy, they can move around. They don't have to start at 6 p.m. They can go anytime they damn please. They go with their girlfriend or whatever. They can drive out in the countryside. And this fantastic mobility comes in. The idea of individual transportation and super mobility. Okay, let's call it super. Comes in, preparing people for the automobile. In other words, you can't have the automobile suddenly descend from heaven. The whole concept of getting people to desire, a tremendous desire for individual transportation, even better, more efficient and more powerful than just a bicycle. You have to, you need your legs to carry you. Also, the whole wheel technology comes in. The whole idea of using wheels, the idea of rubber tires, which comes in fairly late in the bicycle. Okay, so bicycle manufacturers and bicycle shops, which are small, from the point of view of factory, they're usually small shops, okay, small houses here, whatever, lofts. People get used to bicycle technology, the wheel concept, the rubber tire concept, all the rest of it, which really prepares the way for the automobile. The first automobiles were manufactured in bicycle shops because the people, the artisans, the manufacturers, the technologists were used to this kind of concept of using wheels for transportation. And another thing is that when they got started, the automobile industry got started around 1900, again, after the bicycle craze. You see, after the bicycles in the 1890s, then comes the next step, which is automobiles. The first automobiles were very expensive. They were toys for the rich, and they're beautiful. You see early automobiles with gold and chrome, all that sort of stuff. They're very expensive. And also, you had all sorts of kind of engines, like electric automobiles, there were steam automobiles. All these things were technologically feasible. The only problem was they were not economic for mass production. They were very expensive. And also, they weren't very fast. They didn't have much pickup. So chug along. If you see old movies, or if you're an old car buff, which I'm not, but I know people who are, they can, they look great, and they could chug along at 10 miles an hour, or whatever it is. And you start off with a lot of small businesses. Small blacksmith shops, small blacksmith shops, and small bicycle shops. Basically, were the first automobile, quote, factories, unquote. Henry Ford began there were literally hundreds of automobile companies from 1900 until World War I. The largest company was an electric vehicle company, which was a $20 million corporation, which was very big in that period. It went bankrupt because it didn't have the savvy. It also put its money in a losing proposition, namely electrical cars, which for various reasons don't make it. They're slow and all the rest of it, expensive, etc., etc. So Henry Ford starts off. He was again I guess he was a pietist. He was, I think, forgetting where he was born, but anyway, he starts off with only $20,000. He didn't get any bank loans. He got stuff, and he saved up some money. He got relatives and friends and so forth. Starts his first company with $20,000. Plows back his profits in the usual manner, and originates the idea of everybody else was making beautifully hand-tooled cars, very expensive cars, for collectors, for wealthy people. It was Henry Ford who gets the original idea for a mass production of a uniform car. Instead of stressing beauty and elegance, to stress low cost for the masses. And by doing that, and then interchangeable parts and mass production, which comes in then. See, if you have beautifully hand-tooled cars, you're not going to have any mass production. And it was his idea, it was the idea of Henry Ford that really launches, finishes up, as Hancho points out, really the first real mass production, real interchangeable parts, and therefore having huge factories to do this. But it didn't start off as a huge factory. It started off as an idea in the mind of Henry Ford. He was going for cheap production, cheap cars. The cars that everybody can afford. Those days, a couple $100, I guess, was the price. From 1900 to 1908, for example, to show you the intensity of competition in the automobile industry then, there were 502 automobile companies enter the automobile industry, of which 273 failed. So, of the 10 leading automobile manufacturers in 1903, only one was in the top 10 21 years later. So very heavy turnover, very heavy circulation of elites, if you want to put it that way, entries, failures, all the rest of it. General Motors, I'm sort of jumping the gun here, jumping into the later period, but the point is that Henry Ford, I guess this idea of mass production, plows back profits, cheap cars for the masses and so forth. The first real mass production, first assembly line, the concept of which is you bring everything together in one continuous rolling process with people at each step of the way doing things and the product continuously flowing through until output. The later liberals claim that the assembly line dehumanized the workers. For those who were actually in the assembly line, I thought it was great. They were getting high pay, but not too much, not too onerous work. And also they had a feeling that good product was rolling off the assembly line. General Motors was launched around 1908 by Morgan and DuPont. In other words, it was a coalition. It was essentially a coalition of Morgan and DuPont. DuPont was a major owner. DuPont had been a gunpowder manufacturer for almost about a century. The General Motors was a corporation, a Morgan DuPont corporation, that almost went bankrupt. In other words, it started in 1908, it was a total flopperoo, and its share of the market declined steadily after 1908. And it was only after 1923, it almost went bankrupt. General Motors almost went under in 1923. I'm getting much later in the game, but the thing is that Ford, the problem with Ford was he had this mass production, cheap cars, mass production, cars are beloved by everybody, so huge plants that will run on like enormous big factories, which had the assembly line rolling, etc. The problem is, and so he's doing very well. He had about 80% of the market at one point. He was succeeding, and General Motors was flopping. The other corporations weren't doing too hot. They called in an administrative genius, one of the great geniuses and managerial geniuses of 20th century, Alfred P. Sloan, who saved General Motors. What he did was he changed the whole managerial concept in the 1920s. Ford had everything in his own pocket. In other words, Ford was an individualist. He was just going to manage everything himself. I mean, a giant multi-million dollar company. He insisted on running everything, every detail. Who's going to be the floor sweeper and things like that. And with a few cronies, he had Harry Bennett was his chauffeur, became his vice president, that sort of stuff, an eccentric multi-millionaire. And Sloan said, no, you can't run a huge corporation that way. You have to decentralize. He started the whole committee system of decentralized management, which now, of course, every corporation has. In those days was was unique. Okay, committee system, decentralized management, all the rest of it. Reporting, trying to have individual parts of the company, each of which has its own accounting system and tries to be a profit center. All that stuff really begins with Sloan, which saves General Motors, really turns the whole thing around. So it's not money that does it. Money itself is not going to do anything. You have to have entrepreneurial, managerial, and technological know-how of what to do, an idea of what to do and how to do it. Another thing is that Ford, again, gets conservative in the sense he has this idea of one car which is uniform for everybody. Right? And his idea was you never change it. What the hell? This is the best car, the so-called Model T, black Model T car. And when somebody said, why not have blue and green cars and change models? No, if you do that, it's costlier. It's true in a sense it's going to be costlier to change models, to have new colors. No, everybody's going to have black and that's it. Everybody has this. He had the same model for about 30 years. Ford. This is it. Why not? General Motors was Sloan was the first guy to realize the public wants different colors. They're more affluent now. They're used to the idea of cars. They want green and blue. They want individualized cars. They want model changes. They like to see some change once in a while. Snazzier looking, all that sort of stuff. And General Motors introduced the concept of different model changes, different colors, of appealing to the consumers, even though it might be costlier at the beginning, even though you don't have the low cost for total uniformity. Public wants it. In other words, to them it's not costly because you're giving them a better product. To improve the product by different colors, different styles, different packaging, all the rest of it. Which Ford scorned, being a pietist type and believing everybody should be thrifty anyway, and why shouldn't they have the same product? Frivolous. Well, the public they found, gee, we like different. We like new changes every year. We like new colors and different, lower cars and all that sort of stuff. And Ford almost went bankrupt himself in the late 20s. He was slow in changing. He finally had to retool when he did that. I think it was 1928. He almost went bankrupt because Ford Motor Company, being very, very big and geared to one car and one product, couldn't handle the idea of retooling for different model changes. They almost went bankrupt doing it. And it was then in the late 20s and early 30s that Ford lost its predominance in the automobile industry, where General Motors became the dominant, and still is the dominant company. Because of this new idea it had, okay, we'll give them a higher price, but we'll give them a nicer product they like better. And it worked. And if you're a company which is geared to one huge plant where everything is the same, it's very difficult. You have to, in order to get more flexibility, you have to have a smaller size product, smaller size plant. In other words, as Hounslow points out, when you're in mass production, there's a trade-off. You can either make it very big and very uniform and very low cost, or you can have it smaller and more flexible, and maybe higher cost but more flexible and be able to change faster. And you have to make that decision, and it depends on the market and all these other changes. So one of the things it shows is no company ever has a monopoly unless the government enforces it. There's always some other guy coming up. In the words of the great philosopher Satchel Paige, the famous baseball pitcher, don't look behind because some guy might be gaining on you. Don't look back because some guy might be gaining on you. This is exactly what's happening. Somebody else is always coming up with a new idea, maybe better, etc., etc. And so you always have to be on the alert. Actually, you should look back. That's what the answer is. So, at any rate, so Ford was the first one to really come in with mass production, completely mass production, completely interchangeable product. Yeah.
He can talk about trading companies. Also mentioned in his book about stocks and shares. Mm-hmm. He says something about what are stocks?
What are stocks? Well, basically, it's really a stock. The question is, what is the stock worth? In other words, here's a company, a new corporation, a new merger is formed, General Electric, U.S. Steel, whatever. The promoters say, we think it's worth $100 million, let's say. So if there are 1 million shares outstanding, they say, we think it's worth, each share is worth $100, right? If they can get the public to go along with this, if the public says, yes, if they buy it for $100 a piece, a new share, this is what they think it is. Okay? It might well be this is an overestimate. Maybe it's worth only $20 a share. In that case, the whole thing will collapse. So it's not so much that watered is a sort of a pejorative term. It really means, in other words, here's the promoter, the investment banker, essentially, which underwrites the shares. Say Morgan underwrites U.S. Steel. They say this is worth $100 million because it's going to be great profits in the future. Well, you don't have to believe this crap. In other words, it's really a question of whether you believe in Morgan's estimate. Okay? If you believe in it, you'll buy it for $100. If you're a sucker enough. If you're skeptical, you won't buy it for $100. So eventually the price goes down to $20. This turns out to be water, unquote, quote unquote. But it's not illegal. It's not some kind of fraud going on, which is what the water implies. The question of what you think, the whole stock market is a question of estimates. Do you think this company is worth more or less? It goes on all the time. And if you accept the investment banker's estimate, of course, you might be taken in. But, there's no reason for you to accept it unless you're dumb. That's really, unless you're suckered in by the whole situation. Unless you think that the monopoly is going to be worth a lot. In other words, it's not so much they were defrauding the stockholders. They probably really thought there's going to be a big monopoly profits for them, and then they whether they thought it or not, this is what most of the people thought. And they find out, no, it doesn't work. By that time, they make losses. So that difference turns out to be, quote, water, unquote. Beg pardon? Yeah. Yeah, well, stocks are, in other words, the corporations have stock ownership. In other words, if you're a partnership, as most manufacturers were before 1890, Rockefeller was a partnership. You have 8 partners, let's say. Okay? If the assets are $80 million, pretty big for a partnership. It means each of the 8 partners is worth $8 million, right? Has 1/8 share. If you're a corporation, you can sell the shares. The shares are sort of official out there. There's let's say there are 1 million shares of General Motors, right? And this means if you buy 1 share of General Motors in the stock market, you're a 1/1,000,000th owner of General Motors. If you buy 100,000 shares, you're a 10% owner. So a share is a proportion of a total ownership, entitles you to a certain proportion of the assets, the profits, and all that sort of thing. So the thing about corporation shares, you can sell them easily. If you're a partner, you can't sell your partnership very easily, hardly at all. Your other partners have to buy you out or something. It's very difficult. I know the Zabar's, I think, famous grocery store, supermarket, gourmet supermarket in Manhattan, the owner wants to sell. It's very difficult. You've got like 1/3 share. How do you do it? You have to, the other guys your partners have to buy you out. So in a corporation, you can sell a share very easily on the stock market. So a stock is a share of all the stocks in the corporation. It's a share of ownership. It means ownership of assets, ownership of profits coming in, or dividend, which is increase of assets. So a bond is something different. A bond is a debt, an evidence of debt credit to the corporation. So if General Motors floats bonds, let's say $10 million bond. If you buy a $100 bond, it means this is part of the debt. So you're entitled then to $10 a year, whatever the thing happens to be, the interest on the bond.
But you don't get $10 a month that you pay for the stock?
No, stocks are a share of ownership. You get whatever the corporation decides to give you. The corporation, the board of directors of the corporation represents the stockholders. They're like the stockholders vote for the board. They decide how much profits to share every year and all that. It's called dividends. They share let's say you make profits of $10 a share, you declare a dividend of $6 a share, and take the other 4 and plow them back into the corporation.
The volume of shares, the number of...
There's a certain number of total shares. The volume of trading depends on how much is traded every day. They trade it back and forth. I buy a share of General Motors stock from you, it means that one share is traded. If you don't buy it, so that's a question of how much people are buying and selling back and forth. So, but a bond is an evidence of debt, and entitles you to a certain amount of dollars per year. Marketing becomes important in this whole period around 1900. In other words, selling, it's not enough to produce something. You have to sell it to the consumer. You have to bring it to transport it to the consumer and sell it, package it, like National Biscuit Company packaged food, gasoline is packaged through gasoline stations. All these things had to be thought of and then developed. They're just as important as actual production. It shouldn't be forgotten. Producing something is not enough. You have to get it to the consumer. You have to package it, ship it, break bulk, in other words, put it in smaller packages in one sense or another, and then sell it. American Tobacco Company, James Duke, was the first one to really sell cigarettes in that way, to market them. Becomes a sort of, quote, monopoly, unquote. Actually, there's a merger. American Tobacco Company was originally a monopoly in 1891, I think. And of course, the shares began to fall right away, the same sort of stuff. It was originally a merger of a whole bunch of tobacco companies. The sugar trust is another classic example of this sort of thing. The sugar refiners tried a cartel in the 1880s. It didn't work. Several cartels. Finally, in 1886, they all decided to merge. In those days, there was a geographical concentration of sugar companies. There were 23 sugar refining companies in the United States. This is 1886. 10 of them were in New York City, and 6 of them were here in good old Brooklyn. In other words, Brooklyn had 2 big manufacturing concentrations those days: sugar refining and beer. We had a lot of breweries. So Brooklyn was a separate city, by the way, until about 1902 or something like that. It was like the 5th largest city in the United States or something around that. And the 3 largest companies were in Brooklyn, and with 55% of the total. So it seemed to be an easy industry to try to merge, because it was heavily concentrated in one city here, and 2, New York and Brooklyn. And much of these were owned by the Havemeyer family. So Havemeyer was in an excellent position to lead the idea of a merger, a sugar refining merger. And Harriman testified before Congress on this thing, and he said he lobbied, of course, for a heavy tariff on sugar. The problem is if you have a merger, you have a cartel or a merger or something, you cut production and raise prices. There's a danger you might start importing sugar. So you try to have a tariff to keep out foreign sugar. Havemeyer testified before Congress in 1897 as a big tariff bill, and he said, and he of course was the leader of the sugar trust, and he said, the mother of all trusts is the custom tariff bill. The tariff is the mother of all trusts. The existing bill and the preceding one have been the occasion of the formation of all large trusts. Now, what he's saying is the high Republican tariff of 1897 was the basic reason why for the merger wave 1898, 1901. In fact, they had a huge increase in tariffs across the board, provided a shelter from foreign competition, by which the domestic firms could try to have a trust and try to have monopoly prices. The refined sugar, for example, in 1899, Congress put on a very high tariff on refined sugar, about 71% tariff. There's raw sugar and refined sugar. We're not talking about what's refined sugar. To give you an idea, was obviously the economic thing would have been to import refined sugar from Great Britain. Okay, so we now have some tables here of here's a British price. This is the price of refined sugar. Okay. That means it shows sugar we eat, we buy in the stores. In 1885, the price, this is British price in Great Britain, plus transportation costs to bring it, from Britain to the United States. Okay. British price plus transportation costs in 1885 was $4.70 per hundredweight, which is the sugar weight unit, and for CWT. The U.S. price for U.S. refined sugar was $6.44. In other words, even with the transportation cost, it was much cheaper for Americans to buy sugar from Great Britain because it was $4.70 instead of $6.44. So we slapped on a very high tariff, and the British price plus the tariff, plus transport. In other words, this plus the tariff amounted to $8.38. So we make the tariff so high that it costs $8.38 to buy British sugar and only $6.44 for American sugar. Almost doubling the price of British sugar. This keeps on, and it's more or less the same throughout. There are ways of constantly trying to raise it. The problem comes in with raw sugar. Raw sugar comes in came in from Cuba and the Dominican Republic and so forth. And of course, the Sugar Trust is trying to keep free, wants to import raw sugar free. They can have nice cheap raw sugar, then have a big tariff on refined sugar. Well, they had a problem, a conflict with the American sugar growers. So the sugar people, the Louisiana cane growers, the mountain beef growers, sugar beet growers, wanted to have high tariff on imported raw sugar to keep out Cuban and Dominican and Hawaiian raw sugar. In the meantime, the sugar refiners wanted to have a low tariff because they wanted to have cheap raw sugar. Big political conflicts over this. Anyway, the refined sugar, to get back to refined sugar people, they try to merge. They finally have a grand merger of all the, almost all the sugar refiners under Havemeier's direction into the American Sugar Refining Company. This is 1887. Located in Brooklyn. In fact, one of my students a few years ago was actually still working for a plant, for a American Sugar Refining Company plant here in Brooklyn. And this consisted of 80% of the total sugar refining in the United States, 80% of the share of the market. And of course, as soon as they got that, they cut production and raised price. Why else have a merger unless you're going to do this? So they immediately cut production and raised price. And bingo, new competitors come in. The key guy who formed the trust was Henry Havemeyer. We got a big bonus for forming the trust, being the head of this, president and chairman of the board of this whole outfit. So immediately, as I say, they cut production. They had 20 plants, this outfit, and they immediately cut the number in half, and they dismantled the other half and all the rest of it. They raised prices, and bingo, of course, new firms come in. So in 1 year, they're down to 73% from 80. In other words, here they merge 80% of the sugar refining market. They cut the production, they scrap a few plants, but new firms are not coming in. The share of the market's cut in 1 year by 7%. And by 1889, it was down to 66%. So once again, the fact that there's free entry into the sugar refining business, there's no government keeping them out, obviously. They keep losing them share of the market all the time to new companies which are popping up. So the result, the prices fall. Not only does the price fall again, they're stuck with new competitors who are coming in with new machinery, new technology, not stuck with the old high-cost technology. And the sugar refining companies are worse off than it was before. So, for example, in 1890, enters a new guy to compete with the American Sugar Refining Havemeyer Trust, Klaus Spreckels. It starts the whole Spreckels caper. I think Spreckels' family is still around, providing playboys. Spreckels was known as the Sugar King of the Sandwich Islands in the Pacific. He builds I guess the West Indies, right? Anyway, he builds a new plant at Philadelphia with a much bigger refining capacity of 3,000 barrels a day, and he's out-competing the sugar refining company. He gets a new Baltimore sugar refinery, and he's moving into this market, out-competing everybody, and they're stuck again. Severe competition is a fall in profits, and the price of refined sugar goes down from $6.17 per hundredweight, $4.69 because of the new Spreckels competition. So, and this keeps going on. Every time they try to merge and have a cartel or a merger and monopoly and cut production and raise price, some new competitor comes in and cuts the price, and they have a lower share of the market. Again, so what does Havemeyer do? He decides to buy out Spreckels, okay? So he bought him out. He formed a great new company in 1892, the new American Sugar Refining Company. They figure this will solve the whole problem. The new improved sugar refining company with Spreckels now in it. Now they have a merger of 6 new companies, a $75 million corporation. They now have 95% of the sugar refining production. So this is it, boy. Now we have a monopoly. We can now cut production and raise prices. The only firms that were left after 1892 were 2 3 teeny independents. One small plant in Boston, which only put out 500 barrels of sugar a day, and the other was 2 small plants in Louisiana, and that was it. So what happens? Well, they form it, and old sugar hands who've gotten out of the sugar business say, hey, this is fantastic. Now we have higher prices. These guys have cut production, raised prices. This gives us an opportunity to come back into the business. We can now compete with them. And all of a sudden there comes people like Rockefeller. Remember, Rockefeller bought out oil refineries. They make oil refineries so that Rockefeller has to buy it out. It's very costly. Same thing happens now. 2 shrewd operators, Adolf Siegel and Fred Hippel, say, hey, looks like the American Sugar Refining Company is going to buy out every sugar refining plant to keep them from competing with them. So let's produce a plant so they'll have to buy it. So Siegel and Hippel go into the sugar refining plant business. So these suckers will have to buy it. It's great. Nobody can stop them. There's no government ordering them not to. So they make a practice of building sugar refineries so the trust will have to buy them out. And in some cases they found out the water supply was no good there. They couldn't have used it anyway, and so forth and so on. And they keep doing this a lot, and they keep smashing the monopoly. So in a year or so, they're down now to 85% from 95%, and the price of sugar starts falling again, back to 4.1 cents. From the 4.69, 6.17. They can't seem to be able to raise prices and eliminate competition. In 1895-96, they have a new agreement. They try to bring in Hippel and Siegel. They get back to 90% of production from 85. 1895, they're back to 95%, 90%. And again, 1897, a new sugar refining plant comes in. This time it's Klaus Dorscher, who was an old sugar man who gone out of the business. Says, hey, there's a new monopoly here. They're raising the price. Let's nip in with a new plant. Sure enough, Dorscher starts up. Also, the Arbuckle brothers come in. The ancestors of the famous Fatty Arbuckle, the disgraced movie star of the 1920s. They enter the sugar refining business. 1897-98, this busts this whole thing. Again, the share of the market goes down, prices fall again, and and another thing that happens is sugar beets come in more, and so you wind up once again busting the whole cartel. In 1901, they keep trying this thing. I mean, they don't seem to be able to learn much. They bring in Arbuckle. It's okay, we'll bring Arbuckle in, and they form a great new cartel, new merger, I should say, in 1898. 1901, they get almost all the eastern refiners, and they get, they try to bust up, they blow up Speckle's plant, they do some organized vandalism. By 1902, they have a brand new American Sugar Refining Company, with again they have 90% of the production. And again, the same thing happens. So they get 90% of production, their price goes up a little bit, their profits go up, and bingo, things begin to collapse a couple of years later. So this is the this is the record, and we have to quit now. But this record sort of continues. The sugar refining is a beautiful example of this. Because every year they try it, every couple of years it then collapses. They bring new guys in, new guys pop up. And they always keep losing money. They never seem to get to the place where they can really cut production and raise prices.